Hey everyone, excited that you're here today in the second video that we are studying together in the land in between from the land in between to the land that we dream. And in the past video we talked about what is that land in between, what is that place in our lives that we feel stuck, that we need to see movement take place in our lives. And we saw how God spoke to Abraham to continue the journey and how he wants to speak to us to create movement and to continue the journey. A couple of months ago, um, my wife and I we bought a new car. It was an all SUV, and one of the things that we noticed immediately is that there were a couple of things that needed to be repaired. And among those things, there's one in particular that's pretty annoying to me. You see, the car's AC will not fully function until the car is in motion. In other words, you will not experience a cold air, full cold air, until the car is on the road moving. Which, if you live in Florida weather, you know how important it is for us to have cold AC in a car. And so, as a husband that I am, a good husband, I get concerned about my family's comfort and safety. And so I get pretty anxious and I will begin to say things and do things that are not pretty loving in order to see that movement for people to get in the car so we can get the car moving because I want to experience the full AC, which it never sits well with my beautiful wife, if you know what I mean. But what was interesting to me is that the things that motivate us humans to create movement in our lives. I mean, some people get motivated to do things and move things based on fear and anger and disappointment and frustration. And some other people be the opposite. Some people will do things based on love and compassion and hope and faith and things like that. So, what I love about the story of Abraham, it was that it was God's voice who spoke to Abraham and movement took place in his life. The passage right after his father Terah died says that God spoke to Abraham and said, Go, go from your country, from your people, and from your father's household to the land that I will show you. In other words, God was saying to Abraham, leave everything you know and everyone you know to a place, to a land that I will show you. In other words, just leave everything behind to something completely unknown. And when God spoke, Abraham moved. And I know what that's like. A couple of years ago, my wife and I began to feel like God was speaking to us in a personal way, and He was asking us to move from Puerto Rico all the way to Florida. And I want to be honest, it was a really, really challenging thing to do, and I was pretty afraid, and it was going to require a lot from us. But one of the things that we decided in our heart is that we were going to obey, we were going to follow this voice that was leading us and directing us in the direction that He was taking us. And so we decided to make the decision, and it was incredibly sacrificial and difficult. Now, I also have to say that it was probably one of the best decisions we ever made because some of the most incredible lessons, meaningful lessons, and incredible stories came from that decision where we decided that we were going to follow this voice that was moving us from one place to another. And when it comes to the voice of God, that's one of those topics that can seem very elusive for a couple people. I mean, some people think that this is like a theory or an idea or just like a good idea or thought, but they don't believe it's a real thing. And some other people believe that God speaks, but He uses the pages of scriptures only, and that's the only way he talks. And although I agree that God uses the pages of scriptures to speak to us, we also have to come to terms that God loves to speak to us in a personal way if we're willing to listen. There's an interesting passage in the book of Job that says that God speaks again and again, even though people don't recognize it. I mean, just think about that for a moment. Have you ever been there in a situation like that? Like you feel God. You need God to speak. You need Him to give you direction. You need Him to tell you how you should go about that place that you feel stuck in your life, and it feels like He's disengaged or He's not involved. He doesn't care, and you feel like there's this huge disconnection between you and God, and you need to hear Him speak, but it's almost like you cannot. Could have been that he was already speaking again and again. Could it be that you will not able to recognize his voice? I mean, when it comes to the topic of God's voice, the question we should not be asking ourselves is, does God speak? The question we need to be asking ourselves is, are we listening to what God is saying? I mean, because if he speaks again and again and we don't recognize it, we don't perceive it, we can't hear what he's saying, it will be completely useless to us. But if we can hear what he says, I mean, it's going to create movement in us, and it's going to change our lives and our place, our situation, where we are to where we're supposed to be. And you see, I don't want to point out the ways that God uses to speak, because he does speak in many, many different ways. But I do want to point out the necessity we have when it comes to hearing God's voice. And here's why. Because Romans 10:10 says that faith comes by hearing, and hearing his word. It doesn't say that it comes by having heard. It says that comes from hearing. In other words, it's about here and now. It's about the present time. It's about the space and moment in your life where we need to hear him talk, where we need to hear him speak. Because when he speaks to us, faith erupts from within us. And that faith will create the movement that we need in our lives. I mean, there's something beautiful about our history with God. But what was said to us in the past will not move us into the future that we need to step into. Let me give you an example of this. You know, imagine that 9 years ago, my wife and I, we got married. And the day of our wedding, I looked at her and I said, hey, babe, I want you to know something. I love you with all of my heart. And I want you to remember this moment, because I am never, ever, ever saying this again. I mean, how many of you guys know that will not go well in my marriage? I mean, we would probably not be together by now. If you think about it, why does she need to hear I love you again and again? I mean, isn't that part of the nature of us being human? I mean, she needs to hear it today, she needs to hear it tomorrow, and she needs to hear it for the rest of our lives. Because there's something beautiful about encouraging words that can change us and help us and move us, even if we heard them before. You see, there's something powerful about a spoken word that is filled with life that can take you from where you are to where you're supposed to be, or can change you from who you are to who you are supposed to become. And so we got to come to terms. God does speaks, and he might be speaking to you, and you might not be able to recognize it. And he wants to speak to you, and he will do it over and over again. So when God wants to create movement in us, you see that life-changing situation that you have in your marriage that you need, that movement you need to take place in your marriage, you need to hear him speak. When you want to see movement take place in your business, you need to hear him speak. When you want to see movement take place in your leadership or in your relationships, you gotta hear him speak. When you want to see movement take place in that land in between where you feel stuck and you cannot get out of there, and you need to become someone else, you have to hear him speak, because when he speaks, movement will take place in your life. There's an interesting imagery that the writers of Scripture will use to compare God's words, and they compare God's words to food, and some passages will compare God's words to bread, and others will compare his words to honey, and the imagery keeps going on and on. And I think what the writers are trying to do is they need to point out the necessity we have when it comes to hearing his words. And here's why. Because in the same way your body needs food to live and to thrive, in the same way we need his words to become alive and to thrive in every life situation. So if God's words are compared to food for us, then it all starts with hunger. You see, if you want to connect with God's voice, you have to be hungry for His words. There's a story that a couple of years ago I experienced. We went to Haiti, and this trip, and one of the things that we decided to do is we want to give away food to specific communities that we chose at the time. And I remember we got to this house one time, and this house was surrounded by huge metal things. I mean, all around the house, and the windows and the doors were, they all had like bars of metal. And I mean, at first I was kind of confused because this house looked like a jail. I mean, it looked pretty inhumane. But it all made sense after we started delivering the food. Because people in the neighborhood heard about what we were doing and people came in masses. I mean, it turned from something beautiful into an incredible chaos. I mean, with some of our team members, they had to like become like bouncers. They were like pushing people away. They were trying to steal food that was not theirs to take. And in a minute, it all became very chaotic. And here's why. Because we were surrounded by a community of very hungry people. And that's what hungry people will do when you are the one who carries the food. You see, hungry people, they will do whatever it takes to fulfill their need. And so there's a passage in the book of Jeremiah that he says something really, really interesting. Jeremiah said this. He said, "When I discovered your words, I devoured them. They are my joy and my heart's delight." I mean, just think about the imagery this guy is painting. I mean, this guy is like super, super hungry. And suddenly he discovered those words, he perceived those words, he recognized those words, and those words are filled with life, and he needs life, he's hungry for life. And he begins to devour those words with such a passion because he's so hungry, and God has what he needs. He has the food that Jeremiah needs. And so when he starts devouring those words, they became joy and delight. In other words, happiness and pleasure. I mean, this guy became so filled with life that he could not just experience nothing else. It became more real than nothing else. Imagine if you were to see this guy on the street or at your workplace or somewhere else, that you see this guy is constantly happy and filled with life and joy and excitement, and you became curious about it, and you were like to ask him his secret. What's your secret? And you were to approach him and say, "Hey, tell me, what's your secret?" And I always see you so filled with life and joy and delight and pleasure and all that kind of stuff. What's your secret? Imagine if we were to look at you and say, "Hey, yeah, I was so hungry, and then I discovered God's words, and they became joy and delight to me." I mean, you will look at this guy and you will think, "You're creepy, you're weird." Unless you were the one experiencing what Jeremiah was experiencing. Unless you were the one who was really hungry for his words. And then you began to discover those words. And every time God spoke to you, you saw them, you heard them, and you began to devour those words. And suddenly you became so filled with joy and happiness and delight and pleasure that you cannot just simply contain what was inside of you. And you were the one where everyone else saw that were filled with life. There's a necessity that we have when it comes to hearing God's words. Because if they're food for us in the here and now, we need them because we cannot pursue tomorrow's dreams on yesterday's meal. We need a daily meal. We need to constantly, daily feed on his words. Imagine if you were to be the guy on the street. Imagine if you were to be the person at work that people saw and there was this incredible delight, and you were not waiting for life to bring you joy and delight. You were bringing life and delight and joy to every life situation. What will your life look like if you were to begin to discover those words? You begin to perceive them, you begin to hear them, you begin to eat them and devour them with such passion. And everyone were able to see this guy is different. There's something incredible. And every time God spoke, movement took place in your life. Every time He said something, movement took place in your life. So the question we got to ask ourselves now is, how can I get to a place where I can become hungry for God's words? And here's the answer though. Change your soul diet. I mean, you have to start from all the other voices that are speaking to you, meaningless conversations that are less from the life that God intends for you to have. You got to pull back. You got to step back. You got to starve from all the noise that is constantly trying to drag your attention, filling you up with things that are less than God's purpose for your life. You have to become hungry. And for some of you guys, that will be something where you gotta make very intentional decisions. Some of you guys are gonna have to pull back from some relationships that are pulling you back from you becoming hungry for God. And some of you guys, you might have to kind of cut back just for a while from social media, or some of you guys, you might have to say take some time off from work. I mean, or you might have to get surrounded with very specific people that already recognize and are devouring and eating on God's words so that they can help you and point you in the direction of God's voice for your life. You see, there's something about hunger that is really, really interesting that I want to point out. When people are hungry, there's a couple of different things that it will do to your body. First, you will become very sensitive to food. I mean, you can smell food from miles away. Second, food becomes very attractive. I mean, good food, bad food, it doesn't matter. You will eat whatever. And third is food becomes very tasty. I mean, your taste bud becomes very sensitive, and you can perceive and you can feel the different flavors in detail. And I think this is the same when it comes to God's words. You see, when you become really hungry for God's words, you become very sensitive to His words. You become His words become very, very attractive. Even the things that are difficult to swallow, you will eat them. And last, it's like you will begin to taste with detail everything He's saying to you and enjoy it. And they will become joy and delight for your life. On June 26th, this past this couple of past months, this year, I decided to take some time off from work because I was so hungry. I needed God to speak to me. I needed God to point me and direct me in some specific things in my life that were gonna change everything for us. And I was so confused, and I was working this job that it became so meaningless for me. And I was just so tired and exhausted. I needed to be refreshed. And I decided I was gonna take a day off from work, and I was gonna go separate myself in an isolated place, and I was just gonna look for God. And I remember at first I had to fight feelings of guilt and feelings of like I was irresponsible, like I was actually taking a very unwise decision by doing this. And I had to push through all those emotions, and I just kept going, and I'm glad that I did, because that day changed everything for me. You see, God began to speak to me so loud and so clear. It was almost unbelievable. He began to direct me, and His words became so filled with life and joy and delight. I remember that day changed everything for me. In fact, part of the reason why I'm doing this, part of the reason why I'm starting to get involved in this is because I've been receiving something that is so beautiful and so incredible, and I just want to give it away to people. I just want to encourage whoever wants to listen, because I have devoured His words, and their joy and delight for me. And I hope that will be the same for you. In the video that is coming next, we're gonna discover some of the results of an incredible woman that was really, really hungry, and she approached Jesus, and how she got breakthrough when she did. But her hunger drove her, and her hunger got her the breakthrough that she was looking for. Thank you guys for joining in, connecting with me. Love you guys much. Have a good day.